Alright folks, welcome back. It's time for us to continue building our Destiny 2 subclass tier list. If you missed part 1, you can check the link in the top right. In that part, we established some rules to keep the tiering from being needlessly complicated and started our tiering with the Warlock's Dawnblade subclass branches. There's a lot of interesting things to consider with each branch, and those things will inform the tiering we talk about today for the Warlock's Stormcaller. Let's get started. Over the years, the Stormcaller subclass has been a mixed bag, but every expansion has improved it either through direct buffs or indirectly through tweaks to exotics. The question is, how good is it? Before we figure that out, let's talk about the universal mechanics for the Stormcaller. It has the same class abilities as all Warlocks, so a Healing Rift and an Empowering Rift, access to 3 types of glides, Balanced, Burst, and Strafe, and finally it has 3 grenades, the Arc Bolt Grenade, the Storm Grenade, and the Pulse Grenade. Now that we know what the Stormcaller is working with, we can start figuring out how good its branches are, and we're going to start with the top branch, the Attunement of Conduction. The ability this subclass branch is most known for is Arc Web, enemies damaged by your grenade or melee chain lightning to nearby enemies. Each chain reduces the cooldown of your grenade slightly. It damages a single target and nearby targets are hit with chain lightning from Arc Web. Transcendence is a passive ability that enhances your super, Storm Trance. When cast with full grenade and melee energy, Storm Trance lasts longer and fully restores your health. Finally, Ionic Blink is an additional ability attached to your super. You can activate it during Storm Trance to teleport a short distance. Now that we know what the Attunement of Conduction does, we can start breaking it down. This subclass branch has a lot of potential, but it doesn't always get realized. The Arc Web passive gives your grenades the chance to spread their reach across a massive area, but in practice you'll usually only hit a few targets with the chain lightning, and the CDR you receive from it is nice, but not game-breaking. The damage dealt by Arc Web chains is also not impressive, but since it's improving the capabilities of your grenades, it puts the Attunement of Conduction a step above its fellow Stormcaller branches. With that said, Arc Web simultaneously exposes this branch's strengths and weaknesses. While it specializes and excels at dealing damage to large groups, it's average against single targets. This becomes more apparent when you're fighting major level enemies and above. That problem becomes worse when you turn up the difficulty. The base damage of your grenades is fine, but it's not going to decimate the game's toughest enemies, and the melee ability Chain Lightning, like all Warlock melee abilities, does terrible damage. Now because Chain Lightning can trigger Arc Web, it's not trash tier, but it's still not great and it's barely good. You only want to activate it against large groups of enemies, but the problem is when you run in and try to zap 4 or 5 Vex with Chain Lightning, you're probably not going to kill any of them, so if you're not careful, you'll get punished for trying to do the thing that your subclass branch is supposed to be good at, and that's damaging multiple targets. Let's turn our attention back to the idea that the Attunement of Conduction should only activate its abilities against large groups of enemies. Storm Trance is a roaming super, and its ability to clear out huge groups of enemies is impressive, but its damage output is relatively low, so again, it runs into problems when confronted with major level enemies and above, especially if they're grouped together. With all of that said, I wouldn't say any part of this subclass feels bad even when you turn the difficulty dial up, but it does have some shortcomings that keep it from being a flawless creation. And that's actually a good thing. It feels good to know that when I play the Attunement of Conduction, that my job, my specialty, is dealing as much damage to as many targets as possible. And there are a few subclasses that struggle to keep up with the area damage the Attunement of Conduction can put out. I can even enhance my area damage capabilities further with the Crown of Tempest's exotic helmet. Arc ability kills grant a stacking buff called Conduction Tines that reduces the cooldown of arc abilities and grants super energy. This exotic significantly increases the quantity of grenades and melees I can use, provided I don't throw them somewhere stupid, and if you can keep the buff running consistently, you'll get a lot of supers too. One last thing to note, the passive abilities that benefit Storm Trance aren't good in PvE at all. Ionic Blink is something you want to avoid using in PvE as much as possible. It drains super energy on activation and doesn't move you that far. Transcendence is useful, but whenever I play this subclass branch, when there are moments when I can and should use my super, I don't feel like waiting for the stars to align for a few extra seconds of tickle fingers. So, to wrap things up, the Attunement of Conduction is good at some things but not great at anything. It's a specialized subclass branch that deals area damage better than some, but it's a little bit undertuned, so it's going to land in the B tier. Next up, the Stormcaller's bottom branch, the Attunement of Elements, feels like a toned-down version of the top branch. It trades in area damage superiority for a balance between group support through rifts and DPS buffs. Its signature ability is the Arc Soul. Your rifts now grant you or any ally that steps in it an Arc Soul that acts as an autonomous turret. It fires at anything in your field of view. Next, the Electrostatic Surge passive improves your rifts. They last longer and they charge faster when you're near allies. Your melee ability is Rising Storm. It damages a single target, and on hit it reduces the cooldown of your grenade, melee, and grants super energy. Finally, the passive ability Landfall is an enhancement to Storm Trance. On activation, Storm Trance fires a bolt of lightning into the ground that damages nearby enemies. The most unique element in the Attunement of Elements, pun intended, is the Arc Soul. This little guy is a clever way of increasing yours and your allies' DPS. While it's not as straightforward or efficient as a simple weapon damage buff, the autonomous fire provided by the Arc Soul has an uptime and ease of use that's unmatched by other buffs in the game. The Attunement of Grace's Empower weapon damage buff has a 5-second duration and requires a melee hit to activate. It's S tier without a doubt, but its uptime and ease of use is outshined by the Arc Soul's 14-second duration and activation criteria. It activates and refreshes itself whenever you touch your healing rift, making its actual duration more like 34 seconds. Apply that damage and duration to all your teammates and you've got yourself something legitimate on your hands. Unfortunately, the rest of the kit in the Attunement of Elements doesn't deserve the same level of praise, but none of it is completely bad either. The Rising Storm melee ability managed to escape obscurity by having several utilities attached to it. Next, the Landfall passive adds a fun burst of damage to the activation of your Storm Trance super. The damage isn't high, but it's enough to clear out red bar enemies, and it synergizes well with the Storm Dancer's Brace exotic chess piece, though I'd be lying if I told you that exotic is good. Don't use it, it's not good. Another positive note for the Attunement of Elements, it has good synergy with 3 of the 4 Stormcaller exotics and doesn't feel objectively better with one or the other. Each has its own merits and associated playstyles. My personal favorite is the Getaway Artist for its enhancements to the Arc Soul. It makes the branch's best ability better. It increases the Arc Soul's volley from 3 projectiles to 6, hits reduce the cooldown of your grenade, and you can consume your grenade to activate your Arc Soul. With the Getaway Artist, it's possible to have a 100% uptime on the Arc Soul, and that's awesome. On the flip side, the Crown of Tempest is the only exotic armor choice you should make when you're playing as the Attunement of Conduction, the top branch. Flexibility and build diversity might not always help you clear through content faster, but it does keep things interesting and often leads to fun discoveries. So, I'm in a tough spot with this one. The Arc Soul is great in some ways, but I don't think it's enough to elevate this subclass branch to the top of the charts. And its other abilities are definitely not winning any awards, but they're not losing either. I'm a little bit sad to give the Attunement of Elements the ranking I'm about to give it, because I do enjoy it, but I can't put it higher than C tier. If its super wasn't a carbon copy of the top branch's Storm Trance with an electric fart on activation, if its melee packed a little bit more punch in addition to its utilities, if the Arc Souls hit a little bit harder, and if Electrostatic Surge made my Rift cooldown a little bit faster, we'd be having a different conversation. But unfortunately, we're not. The final branch of the Stormcaller is the Attunement of Control. For its abilities, first we have Ionic Trace. Defeating enemies has a chance to create an Ionic Trace. Collecting these traces grants energy to all of your abilities, and your super. Next, the passive ability Pulse Wave causes being critically wounded to trigger an energy wave that boosts yours and your allies' reload and movement speed. Your melee ability is Ball Lightning. You fire an arc projectile that travels forward and releases a perpendicular blast of lightning if it doesn't make contact with a target. Finally, the super ability is Chaos Reach, a replacement for Storm Trance. It fires a long-range channeled beam of concentrated arc energy, and it can be deactivated early to save super energy. The Attunement of Control is a great example of how you can design a fun class without the need for an intricate gameplay loop. But because it's so simple, sometimes it leaves me feeling like it's incomplete. Furthermore, the Stormcaller overall highlights the fact that the tuning of abilities is vitally important to a class's success and failure. Ball Lightning suffers from the same issue that I'll be repeating whenever I talk about bad Warlock melees. But I want you to say it with me this time. Low damage and no utility is bad. If an ability isn't going to have an additional utility-based effect attached to it, one of two things needs to happen. It either needs to do crazy damage or be usable in high quantities. We saw the latter in the Warlock's Attunement of Sky. When fighting airborne, the Winged Sun passive reduces the cooldown of the Celestial Fire melee ability by 25% per kill, giving it a high uptime in exchange for low damage. The damage on Celestial Fire is a little bit too low, but the thought process behind how it was balanced is reasonable. Ball Lightning's damage is low and its frequency of use isn't as high as it should be, even with the help of the Ionic Trace passive. Ionic Trace on its own is an extraordinarily strong passive ability. It provides CDR for literally every action in your kit, namely your grenade, melee, rift, and it grants super energy whenever you collect one. But it doesn't do anything to make the lackluster Ball Lightning or base level functionality of your grenades or rift any better. Pulse Wave, the other passive in this subclass, is not bad, but it leaves a lot to be desired. In the previous video, we talked about the continuing struggle developers have when trying to balance on-kill abilities with how hard they are to trigger, and the effectiveness of the ability when it doesn't kill the target. That same struggle exists with abilities that activate only when your health is at a certain threshold. The balancing issues this time are, how much value does the ability provide when it's active? Should it provide passive benefits and become stronger when special conditions are met? And finally, does the ability's activation cause the player to interact with the game differently? Pulse Wave's benefits only trigger when your health is critical, and its benefits aren't game-changing. In lower difficulty environments, if you're playing with the slightest bit of competence, you won't see its effects much. At the higher end, its effects aren't good enough to dramatically change the way you approach combat. The reload speed increase it provides is significant, and it's spread to all your allies, which is nice. Also, in some cases, reloading 500 milliseconds faster can make or break you when you're going toe-to-toe with a thirsty Cabal with a hate boner for Guardians and Space Magic. The boost in movement speed it provides is negligible, and again, neither of those effects come into play if you aren't critically wounded. My point is, if a passive ability is only going to trigger when my character's on death's door, I want to notice all of its effects when it activates, and I want them to seriously help me out of a bad situation. Besides Ionic Traces being an amazing passive, the other saving grace for the Attunement of Control is its super, Chaos Reach. Chaos Reach is one of the top 3 best supers in the game. Its damage potential is absurd, and it works well in every situation. It can clear out hordes of minor and major enemies ridiculously fast because of its massive damage output, and it packs enough punch to melt through boss level enemies with ease. When paired with the Geomag Stabilizer's exotic boots, it goes beyond S tier. These boots extend the duration of Chaos Reach on hits, and it generates super energy while you're sprinting if your super is at least 80% charged, which essentially reduces the charge time of your super by about 20%. Even without the Geomags taking this super from S tier to God tier, the frequency of use gained from the ability to cancel the super early to save energy puts it miles above most of the competition. So overall, the Attunement of Control is another mixed bag. Its moment-to-moment gameplay is fun because you get to run around trying to collect Ionic Traces, but it's lackluster because its active abilities and passives aren't that strong. Your melee Ball Lightning is trash, and your grenades and rift are base level functionality, but Pulse Wave is decent, albeit in need of some buffs or even a rework. And finally, I have to say again, Ionic Trace is a phenomenal passive ability because it's fun to interact with and it's effective. Chaos Reach, your super, goes above and beyond the level of the gods. I gave the Attunement of Flame bad marks for having a good super and crap abilities, but this time, the abilities are mixed and the super is God tier. The way I see it, the Attunement of Control is going to fall into A tier. The good things it has are so great that they make me forget about the bad. And there it is. That's going to do it for the tiering of the Stormcaller on our Destiny 2 subclass tier list. We've still got a very long way to go, but things are starting to fill out pretty nicely, and it's going to be fun to see all the different subclasses on this list when things are done. Now, of course, everyone is going to have a slightly different opinion about where a certain subclass branch should be ranked on a tier list, so if you have thoughts on anything that I've said so far, be sure to let me know in the comments below. Also, if you've been enjoying this series of videos and you'd like to support the channel more than you already do just by watching, liking, subscribing, and commenting, you can head over to patreon.com/iBluairJgR to become a patron. As always, the name of the game is Destiny 2, the name of the channel is iBluairJgR. There's plenty more stuff for us to do, so stay tuned, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.